Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to WASA Distance Education and NBV3E. Today is our last recording, our last class for the 2024 school year. Wow, time is just flying. And why do I have that up there? I don't know. Show full meeting window. Okay, share. Yes, share. Good. Okay. Sorry about that. I was just a little confused about what was actually happening on my screen. But, anyways, back to where we were. Yes, we're almost done. Uh, well, this year is coming to an end, 2024. We still um, have over half of the school year left. So if you have been working on this course at all, still please continue to do so and start sending in some assignments if you haven't sent any in yet, and or if you have sent them in, just continue to do so, and you'll get this credit in no time. As far as the recordings of this class, well, we're going to continue on with semester 1B for another 3 weeks after we return in January. All right, so we have this natural break happening. We should finish up on unit number 3 this week. But we will do a review of the unit and maybe some of the other key questions and lessons previous to that when we get back. Okay? And I'll be keeping my eye out on anything cool that's going on as far as treaties and self-determination and governance to share with you when we get back as well. Um, so the recent treaties that have been going on, well, we'll look at today on the sheer huge volume of treaties that have been signed and others that are working their way through the courts. I do have a document here, actually it's from the textbook, that lists and numbers those treaties. So we'll bring that up in a second. Let's start in on lesson number 14. Okay, so I think we pretty well cleared up everything from 13 about political leadership. That key question 13 was mostly concerned with, we went through that in great detail. Now, there isn't much in these units that, as far as content goes, that might help you give good, thorough answers to these questions. But our videos have lots of nice meat in them for you to interpret and translate to answer these questions, okay? So please review back on any lesson, on any video that we have on YouTube. They've all been marked there. If you're having a hard time finding them, then just contact me and I can point you in the right direction, okay? Anyway, so let's move on then to treaties and self-determination. Now, we've been touching on treaties a lot in the last week or so. And along with treaties comes self-determination. Self-determination is the highest order of um, uh, people's needs. You know, we got some of our basic needs like safety, but self-determination is way up there, and everyone should be have the opportunity to be able to determine um, where they're at in their life and what their beliefs are and where they're going. So let's look at the learning goals here then. Uh, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the differences between the way Aboriginal peoples viewed treaties and the way colonial and Canadian governments viewed treaties. You'll be able to describe significant agreements, and the characteristics of those agreements. Uh, and you'll be able to describe how the Indian Act marked a change in the legal relationship between government and Aboriginal peoples and why it is still controversial. Um, so, keywords for you to define, and of course you'll always find these definitions in your textbook, the readings that we gave you for this for this unit, treaty and self-determination. All right, so we do have our explanation here on page 18. Treaties are agreements that allow peaceful relationships between two nations. Each party in a treaty has equal status. Each party has duties and obligations to the other. To the First Nations peoples of Canada, treaties are more than just written documents. They are living things meant to last as long as the sun shines and the river runs. Since 1982, treaties have been protected by the Canadian Constitution, which affirms existing Aboriginal treaty rights. Britain's Royal Proclamation of 1763 identified First Nations as nations and set aside lands for their exclusive use. The Royal Proclamation is still considered as the basis for all treaties between the British Crown, thus Canada, and First Nations. Originally, the treaty signed by the First Nations and the new settlers involved peacekeeping or trade. But after the War of 1812, First Nations peoples were no longer needed by the settlers as allies, and the Crown began obtaining land for settlement. They used treaties to do this. These treaties established a pattern for the future: payments of cash and other goods in exchange for use of the land. First Nations saw the treaties as agreements to share their territory with the newcomers. To the Crown, the goal of the treaties was to obtain land for settlers and development. For Aboriginal peoples, treaties support their sovereign right to the lands, to the resources within those lands, and to the right of self-determination. Notice that this is bolded and underlined. It's a very important point that has come up in support of Aboriginal claims or land claims over the last century or so. The phrase, "we are all treaty people," means that the treaties are not only agreements between Aboriginal peoples and the federal government. They exist, are renewed, created, and supported today just as they were historically. They continue to be beneficial to all parties just as they were when they were originally created. This means that all Canadians are members of treaty agreements. All Canadians are treaty people. The world views of the First Nations peoples and those of the English, French, and Canadian governments differ. First Nations people do not see the land as something that can be owned. The land is a gift from the Creator and should not be bought or sold, but cared for. Harvesting rights, for example, are not only part of legal treaties, but are seen as part of their responsibility to care for the land. As harvesters, they are responsible for making sure that the needs of future generations will be met. Aboriginal peoples see themselves as spiritual guardians of the land. The English, French, and Canadian governments saw the treaties as agreements under which the Aboriginals surrendered the land in exchange for payments. In most cases, the government believes this means the First Nations people have given up ownership of the land. However, some nations and some provincial governments are working together to manage sources. And that's happening more and more often now, you know. So, for instance, we used to have in our area, it was called the Crown. Uh, they would allocate a certain amount of land to different logging operations, right? So you had the Abitibi limits and the Great, what was that called again? Great Lakes limits, right? So these big corporations will go in there and log. But closer around Sioux Lookout, they had what was called the Crown Unit. And so recently, over the last 10 years, I believe, the Crown Unit now has become the Lac Seul Management Unit, right? So it's the responsibility of the Lac Seul First Nations. This is my understanding, anyways, and I could be a little off there, but I think this is how it works. And so this is an agreement that's been made between the provincial government and Lac Seul First Nations. And then, so these agreements are popping up all over the place, right? I think there's a big one in the Geraldton Forest, I think. Okay. On page 19, we have support question number 1. Explain the difference between the way Aboriginal peoples view treaties and the way colonial and Canadian governments view treaties. See pages 229 to 230 in the text. Okay, so I'm gonna bring that up here right now. Where are you again? It is under. Okay, I forgot to bring that up. Bear with me. Resources, and it is key question 14. Okay. So what pages was I referring to here? 229 to 230. All right. Let's take a look at these pages. All right. So after read Chapter 6, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples in Canada have been making advances in achieving self-determination and greater control over lands and resources. In many cases, Aboriginal peoples have sought to regain jurisdiction over their ancestral territories, management of resources, justice, and education. So, the land. The numbered treaties were created in Western Canada after the vast area known as Rupert's Land was transformed from the control of the Hudson's Bay Company to the government of the Dominion of Canada in 1869. However, increased settlement of the West would not be possible if the government could not first negotiate agreements with the First Nations who held title to the land. From the perspective of the government, these treaties were agreements in which First Nations ceded. There's a new word for it. Ceded means to yield or formally surrender their rights and title to the lands in exchange for a small area of land set aside for them as a reserve, annual payments, protection, and the right to continue to hunt, trap, and fish. First Nations peoples affected by the near extinction of the bison were eager to receive assistance, and it was hard for them to refuse negotiations. However, many nations still contend their lands were never really surrendered. So, here's a map here that showed the numbered treaties in Canada. Notice, so this was originally Rupert's Land. Hold on. Where's my button? Oh, there it is. Sorry about that. I had a frog in my throat. What a statement, eh? Frog in your throat. How could you get a frog in your throat? Anyways, look at there they are. These treaty areas. Um, and let's see. We have Treaty One. Look at that. Treaty One goes all the way down into the United States. That's fascinating, isn't it? Our area is, for the most part, Treaty 9, right? And so that is the area that's represented by NAN, of course. And we looked at NAN in yesterday's class, right? So Treaty 3 area, that would include, so they would, it would include communities outside of the NAN area. So that would be Dryden, Kenora, Thunder Bay, different. So the communities there are they don't have a real top larger organization representing them like NAN does. So let's just be aware that there are all these different types of treaties that were made uh, over the last 150 years. Actually, most of them were made back in the latter part of the 1860s. So let's continue on then. Okay, 29 to 30. Okay, let's read through page 230 as well, okay? Voices of the Peoples. It is said that there were discussions on the treaty amongst the commissioners, the heads of police, and the natives. However, the government people had a pre-written document containing only their concept of what the treaty entails. They told the Indian chiefs, "This is our terms of the treaty, and this is what will be in the treaty agreement." But in those days, there was nobody at all from the native side to translate or understand exactly the legal jargon in the treaty document. Nonetheless, the Indian chiefs had an indication of why they were there to make a peace treaty. Okay, so, you know, it wasn't a fairly written piece of document because not all people were into the jargon and understood what certain things meant because it was written by lawyers and the whole concept of Western law was so alien to the the chiefs at the time. Um, you can get hung up on the meaning of one word, and it can change the whole context of a treaty. So this was a, an excerpt taken from an Dakota elder named Bill McLean. Here's another one, a fellow named Lazarus Wesley. They didn't. They did not know they um, they were being asked to give up their land. What they thought was the government was only saying that they would plow the land or grow something, nothing more. They didn't know that they were giving up their land. And surely no one could really ever find any statements from indigenous people that they were they made that agreement, right? They never actually said, "Oh, here we're giving you our land." That was never written into the agreement. And let's see, let's take a look. Figure 7-8. A commemorative treaty medal. Silver medals were meant to offer a lasting visual reminder to all the participants of their treaty commitments. Look closely at the images on the medal. Here's another thought and quote from Grand Chief Anthony McCurdy from the Assembly of First Nations. That's AFN. Remember, that's the larger governing body of all the First Nations in Canada. McCurdy was very famous for his stands and how he challenged the federal government. Let's read what he said. Our songs, our spirits, and our identities are written on this land, and the future of our people is tied to it. It is not a possession or a commodity for us. It is the heart of our nations and our traditional spirituality. It is our mother. As you have seen throughout this textbook, Aboriginal peoples place great value on their connection to the land. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 acknowledged the right of First Nation people to live, hunt, and fish on their ancestral territories. It's also ruled that any settlement within these lands, maybe I should enlarge that up a bit. Yeah. Sorry. It's also ruled that any settlement within these lands was to be negotiated by the Crown. Why would First Nations agree to treaties in which their land was surrendered? The quotations above by Nakota elders show that their people believed when they agreed to Treaty 7 in an arrangement of peace. It was acceptable to share the lands and resources. They also understood that the land was to be shared by settlers and used mainly for farming. For the First Nations, agreeing to treaties was a way to retain their lands and their rights to hunt and fish. They understood that settlement would only continue and that settlers would be coming in great numbers. By sharing this land, they would not lose it entirely and the generations to come would be provided for. Okay, now in the next section here in the textbook on page 231 we have a listing of modern treaty claims and agreements. The Williams Treaty signed in 1923. The James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement signed in 1975. In 1987 to 1997, there is a court case where rights were established. The Delgamuukwa versus, that would be a tribe, versus BC. 1990, the Oka Crisis. 1991, Indian Claims Commission created. 2000, and NISGA's final agreement signed. And 2008, Specific Claims Tribunal formed. Okay, so we've looked at some of these agreements already, these claim agreements. Um, the one that is really highlighted that just recently happened is this video that we watched a couple of days ago. The Manitoba Métis Foundation. They signed their a self-government treaty, and that just happened within November the 30th, a couple of weeks ago. Um, but there's others that have come up recently with White Sands. Uh, I have a video on that, which I didn't show you yet, but that's fine. I think we'll wait until we come back. Also, the Algonquin, which are located roughly around the Ottawa River, that geographical area. Um, and there's been a recent settlement there as well. So these claims continue to happen, and I think we actually have, oops. Oh, where are we now? Mm-hmm. Um, okay, we do have a map of that, but we'll look at that in a second. I guess we shouldn't jump ahead too far. All right, so um, so with what we just covered, you should be able to complete support question number one. Explain the difference between the way Aboriginal peoples view treaties and the way colonial and Canadian governments view treaties. And the answer to that can be found on pages 229 to 230, which we just read over. What is the meaning of the phrase, as long as the sun shines and the river runs? How does that phrase relate to the treaties signed hundreds of years ago? Do you know of an example of Aboriginal peoples expressing their belief that they are the guardians of the land on which they live? Okay, so that is, you can get very local here if you want, because a lot of local chiefs, a lot of the uh, people who were involved with um, different organizations uh, have brought that up and mentioned that uh, First Nations people are the guardians of the land. There's a lot of different organizations that are involved in that momentum. Self-determination is the right of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples to control and manage the issues and that matters that directly affect them. Canada's Aboriginal peoples do not seek approval from the Canadian government for their right of self-determination. They want their existing rights, those rights protected within the Canadian Constitution, acknowledged by the government and by all Canadians. The basis for the right of self-determination lies in the treaties. Looking at the map on 229, figure 7.7, we already looked at that. The area in green was known as Rupert's Land until the government of the Dominion of Canada took control of the land from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1869. government realized that it could not settle the area until it negotiated treaties with the First Nations who held title to the land. The government interpreted these agreements or treaties as the First Nations giving up their rights to the land in exchange for small plots set aside for them as a reserve, annual payments, and the right to hunt, trap, and fish. Because the First Nations were facing the near extinction of the bison, they signed those agreements, but still contend that their lands were never surrendered. So, I did mention this is probably an excerpt from the book, and so we did previously cover that. But now we have support question number 2. According to the map on page 229, what treaty governs the area in which you live? How has the treaty signed? How has the treaty signed on your behalf affected your life? So this is, a reflection on how the treaty affects you as an Indigenous person. So you'll either be in our area like Treaty 9 or Treaty 3, right? Where are we now? Yes. Oh, where is that PDF gone now? Where did my textbook go? There we go. Right? So, once again, there's a map, right? So, Treaty 3, if you're in the south here, or in Treaty 9, right? So, all the northern communities, and really extends far right to the Quebec border, that far east. So we have many modern treaty claims. I'm on page 20 now. Today, the rights of Aboriginal people to control their territories are more often recognized by Canadian courts. But there are still challenges. Most Canadians do not understand treaty rights. The Indian Act presents another barrier to settling treaty rights because it prevented First Nations from hiring lawyers to represent them. And this rule did not change until 1951. To deal with Native claims, the government opened the Office of Native Claims in 1974. Before this date, many claims went unresolved, were rejected, or stalled in the system. On page 234, read about the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, for example, on how negotiation resolved the lands claim issue. Okay, so page 234. And I do have that photocopied here. Right there. Okay, so this is this whole section under modern treaty claims and agreements. Here's the part on the paragraphs on the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement right here. So this is something for you to read. We don't have time to really go through this in class, but it's homework. Okay. Notice on the next page we have the response to OCA, the Indian Claims Commission, and then the Specific Claims Tribunal, also on page 135. An interesting table to have a look at is the claims in progress and concluded claims and active litigation at the bottom of page 235. Okay, so they have all the different provinces listed here. The claims that are in progress, so that means they're going through the court systems. here are the claims that have been agreed upon by both parties, I would guess, both the government and the First Nation involved, and then active litigation. So these are the ones that, at the time of the writing of this textbook, were in the courts, right? Interestingly, look at this right here, this little blue insert on the right here. It says British Columbia is unceded Indigenous territory. Unlike the rest of the Canada, we have not entered into nor have we signed treaties, and therefore we still enjoy unextinguished Aboriginal title of all the land and the resources of British Columbia. Well, that's really interesting, eh? Because there was never a treaty signed in British Columbia for all with all the First Nations there. So everyone's left up in a bit of limbo there because um, who makes the decisions? The provincial government or the or the um, individual First Nations. So, but at the time, that's all going through the courts right now, and you can see British Columbia. Let's see, where are we? British Columbia, they got 265 claims in progress, almost 300 concluded, and 10 going through the courts at the time of the writing of this book. So that's more than uh, well, it looks pretty close to equal to the amount in many of the other provinces added together. Hmm. Okay. So let's just go back to the unit here right now. So on page 20, we have modern treaty claims. Today, the rights of Aboriginal peoples to control their territories are more often recognized by Canadian courts, but there are still challenges. Most Canadians do not understand treaty rights. The Indian Act represents another barrier to settling treaty rights because it prevented First Nations from hiring lawyers. Okay, I've read that already. Okay, so right. Okay, so here's where we are right now. In 2008, the Specific Claims Tribunal Act was passed. The tribunal was created by a joint effort of the Assembly of First Nations and the federal government. National Chief Phil Fontaine at the time called it a positive response to the efforts of First Nations people um, um, made for decades in terms of land rights. You may note from the table at the bottom of page 235 that British Columbia has the best record of settling land claims. That is because British Columbia is unceded Indigenous territory. Unlike the rest of Canada, we have not entered into nor have we signed any treaties, and therefore we are still unextinguished Aboriginal title. Okay, so now we can answer support question number 3. Based on what you know about Aboriginal worldviews, why would Aboriginal peoples be determined to retain their lands and provide for future generations? So think about this. This is a support question. The second part of the support question is, what are Aboriginal beliefs and values regarding ownership of the land? How do you think these beliefs and values will affect future land negotiation? And you can see that from the recent uh, courts, that land, that thing about ownership and uh, being the land um, is very much a part of all the treaties and litigation that are taking place at this present day. So, on page 22, we have key question number 14. Um, there, there's there's three. Gee, I'm all twisted up here. And there are three columns here, and 6 rows. So the rows are James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, which we pointed out in the textbook, the Indian Claims Commission, which is also in the textbook, the Specific Claims Tribunal. Moving on to the next page, we have the Nisga's final agreement, the Inuit agreements, and the Métis agreements. Well, luckily, we were able to offer a video on the most recent Métis agreements. And the others we can find um, in our text or in our unit previous to the actual key question, right? Okay. So those are the rows of the table, and the columns here are also titled, and they are in the first column distinguishing characteristics of the agreement. So in this first section here, this first big cell, we will want to list the distinguishing characteristics of the Nisga's final agreement. And then in the next section, immediately to the right, the next column, we'll want to include, in point form, it's fine, the significance of the Nisga's final agreement. And then in the third column here, questions left unresolved, we would want to include in point form the questions that are left unresolved in the Nisga's final agreement. And so we continue on for each of these different agreements, adding these the distinguishing characteristics of that agreement, the significance of that agreement, and the questions left unresolved. So we'll do the Inuit in the same way, and the Métis, and also the James Bay in Northern Quebec, the Indian Claims Commission, and the Specific Claims Tribunal. All right, and with that, you can start in on lesson number 15 as well, which is on justice. We'll come back to this in the new year as well, but if you want to get ahead here, you can read through the text in the unit, right, and then answer key question 15, which can be found on page 33, right? So if you want to jump ahead and complete that, that's fine. If you have questions over the Christmas break, you can email me and I'll try my best to get back to you as soon as I can. But the text that will help you answer the support questions. And the key questions are text pages 250 to 252. And in particular, uh, have a look at this diagram, justice and injustice, on page 250. Okay, so that can refer directly to the text in the unit on page 30, and then support questions um, defining justice on page 31. Sorry, I'm going all over the place here, right? Um, yeah, well, we'll be in for a big discussion when we come back in the new year, okay? So, if you feel like you can plow ahead and get lesson 15 complete, then that's great. But if you can't, we'll look at it in much more detail when we come back in the new year. So, well, we've covered lots of territory, haven't we, in this course so far? And with it, almost completed 3 units and 14 key questions. And I hope you enjoyed the topics that we have covered and that they have been able to um, increase your awareness of the values and aspirations and beliefs of the Aboriginal people in Canada, including the Indigenous people, in the Inuit people, and the Métis people. Anyways, I think I should call it a day. I hope you enjoyed our class for today. I hope you enjoy this class totally overall. And if you have any questions at all, you can contact me here at WASA and we can discuss whatever you like. And if I don't know much about the topics that you want to know about, I can find you all the resources to help you understand um, some of these more complicated things, like the legal treaties. Um, take a lot of reading to really get to the bottom of, but um, it's an important time that we live in, where um, justice is being worked out, um, and probably will go forward, continuing to find a good way for everybody to be related. And as they say, we're all treaty people, and so the more we're aware of what the treaties are, then the better the result will be. Everyone understands each other. Okay, so have a great Christmas, everyone, and enjoy getting together with your friends and family. And we'll talk again, meet again January 6th, I believe. We come back. We will be back then. So we'll see you in the new year. Bye for now.